Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 10 on Latinx representations. There we go. The readings for this week are found on Canvas for week 10, and they're the first and second chapters from Aldama and Gonzalez. So the reading talks about race and Latinxes in Hollywood and makes a number of points about how race is experienced by Latinos and how race sort of has determined historically the experiences of Latinx actors. So white passing actors play white characters and are never marked by their Latinx background, while fair-skinned Spanish actors like Antonio Banderas are cast to play Latino roles. Latinx actors' ambiguous features, like Anthony Quinn, pictured here, allow them to play multiple ethnic characters like Italians or Greeks or Arabs. In his case, these limited roles did lead him to become the first Latinx to win an Academy Award. The reading also talks about brownface, where white actors play Latinx characters. So what we see here overall is a preference, excuse me, a preference given to fair-skinned people, whether they are Latinx or they're from Spain or they're white Americans, to play Latinx parts. Now, actors like Anthony Quinn and his generation didn't have much options if they wanted to have a career in Hollywood to play these ambiguous kinds of characters. But what they brought to the table was their talent, right? I mean, if he was going to be kind of pigeonholed to portray certain kinds of characters, he was going to give the best performance that he possibly could. And this is why he won an Academy Award. The reading also talks about the various stereotypical representations of Latinxes in various media, particularly through Hollywood films. And so they talked about the kinds of images that exist for Latina women as Spitfires, going all the way back to some of the earliest Hollywood films, as you see in the image there. There's also the images of Latinas as either whore or sexually promiscuous, or they're the virgin, good girl kind of image. Or they're also portrayed very often as maids, as we saw in the film Latinos Beyond Real, where they talked about the large number of Latina actresses who are often asked to play maid roles. For images of Latino men, you see them depicted as criminals or villains, the gangbanger, or nowadays very often as the drug lord. In Westerns, they were depicted always as silent and lazy, kind of part of the backdrop of the white Western hero, or they are also portrayed as promiscuous and sexual as quote unquote Latin lovers. And how you see some of these portrayals today, you see in that other image there to the left of the spicy Latina. So the Spitfire has become, in more modern times, the image of the spicy Latina. The reading also talked about language in Hollywood and how language has functioned to delineate the kind of experiences that Latinxes have in Hollywood. The shift from silent movies to what were called talkies resulted in Latinx actors discriminated against in Hollywood due to their accents. So while only silent movies existed, it allowed for Mexican actresses, for example, to be able to perform in those movies because they were silent, right? There was no one could hear their accents. But once the industry shifted from silent movies to movies where there's now dialogue and you can hear the actors and actresses, then that became an issue. They were expected to sound quote unquote white. And the reading also talked about how Spanish accents are allowed sometimes when they are pronounced or exaggerated in order to fit the image of the particular character they're playing. And some of the examples they talked about are Ricky Ricardo in the I Love Lucy show, or Sofia Vergara in Modern Family. The reading also talked about how the Spanish accent is used as a racial marker in films and marks them as other or less than. And we saw this in one of the essays from last week's reading, where the author was talking about how language functions to racialize Latinx people as other or as less than. The reading also talked about passing for Latinx actors and characters, and how passing and upward mobility are connected. In particular, they talked about representations in Ugly Betty, where she has to pass for white in order to become upwardly mobile, and how this raises questions of what kinds of messages are Latinx audiences receiving as a result. That in order to be successful in the United States, or to be acceptable to a mainstream white audience, you have to assimilate into whiteness. And you really kind of see that in this image of Ugly Betty going from wearing her poncho, right, to becoming a honcho, right? And you see sort of how her look changes, how what she wears changes, and so on, right? There are two key points that I wanted to highlight from the reading. Even though they're being critical of these various representations, there were two particular key points that the authors made. One was censoring problematic films or depictions is not the answer. As they state, we believe in total freedom when it comes to the making of cultural phenomena, but in freedom that's grounded in a deep responsibility to the subject matter being reconstructed. And this, especially when a given film or TV product makes explicit claims to factual representation. And this kind of recalls our discussion of representational ethics a few weeks ago in one of our Native American readings that was pointing out, right, the ethics of how do you appropriately, right, or adequately represent different cultures, different people, or even different historical figures. Like we saw in Latinos Beyond Real, they talked about how Emiliano Zapata, for example, was portrayed in Hollywood films that had absolutely nothing to do with who the real person had been in history. The other point that the authors make in this piece are about the concept of narrative plenitude, where they state, we don't necessarily take issue with Latinx's being portrayed as engaging in ethically questionable behavior. What we take issue with is the fact that these seem to be the only narratives circulated in film and TV. And so yes, you know, if Latinos are going to be represented as maids or as criminals or drug lords or what have you, that's problematic. But the bigger issue is that those are the only images that exist, right? That if there was a plenitude of different kinds of narratives, the way we see all sorts of different kinds of narratives around white people, then we wouldn't have the issue of having these folks only be represented in very particular kinds of ways. The film also brought an additional issue to the readings, which was the invisibility of Latinxs in the media, including lack of representation in news media, and also the lack of representation in Ken Burns' historical documentaries on World War II, and also the one about baseball, right? Sort of the irony of having an entire documentary film on baseball and not have any Latinx people in it represented. When you look at the actual demographics of most baseball teams, and they are filled with lots of Latinx people. And that's not just a recent thing, that has been a historical thing. So to not have that representation in what's supposed to be a historical documentary is significant and problematic. And part of this is the significantly small percentage of Latinxes in filmmaking or media production, right? So they're not represented behind the camera or as part of the group of people who are making decisions about what kind of movies are made, what kind of TV shows are made, and so on. So as the film stated, they are denied opportunities to tell their own stories. One of the other key points that I felt the film talked about was the representation of immigrants, right, over time. And it talked about immigrants being represented through the metaphors of invasion, for example, talking about the waves of immigrants that are coming, being depicted as animals, criminals, depicting immigration as a problem, and in many more recent years, seeing immigrants consistently being depicted as Mexicans. So immigrants equals Mexicans, even though we know that the immigrant population is much more diverse, coming from all sorts of different countries all over the world. But in our media, the main face that you see in relation to any kind of conversation about immigrants or immigration is Mexican. And the film also pointed out how these negative images of immigrants has an impact on the kind of laws passed against them. And the film talked about the racial profiling laws that were passed in Arizona a few years ago. So these images aren't innocent, right? They do end up having a real impact on the kinds of laws that get passed and what kind of policies made that impacts these populations, but also how everyday people see these folks, right, and respond to them when they see them. The film also talked about some of the ways that Latinxes have responded to these kinds of representations in the media. And so we saw examples of protests against the stereotypical representations. One example was in the show Seinfeld, in the episode where where one of the characters lights a Puerto Rican flag on fire and stomps on it. That was a huge a protest that followed that incident. And there were other examples in the film of the Latinx population responding to these kinds of representations in the media. Another way that they've responded is by creating their own movies and TV shows. And for one of the examples discussed in the film was the creation of the film Real Women Have Curves. But the problem is that many of these that are created on their own are made independently. They're made outside of sort of the Hollywood machine. And so this means that they have less resources to actually create these kinds of independent films and shows and so on, and also have limitations in distribution, right? So it's not just about making an independent film, but how do you get it out there? How do you get movie theaters to play it and so on? And so when you're sort of producing outside of the Hollywood industry, then you don't have access to those distribution venues in the same way. And so that then creates a limitation as to who gets to see these alternatives that are being created by Latinx filmmakers and artists and so on. So those are some of the key points that I wanted to highlight from the reading and from the film. I would be curious to see your thoughts about the film. So if you want to share some of those, I invite you to post those on the optional discussion post for this week. And that is it for this week. So I will see you next week. Take care.